So we are in United States history. We are in chapter 16, section 2. We're going to be talking about those early years of the Civil War, 1861 to 1863. In our last video, we talked about the Western Theater, basically that area that was on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. As the Appalachian Mountains divided the whole terrain into an east and western campaign. And we saw Grant's success in the west, and we saw his taking over of Vicksburg, also Farragut taking over New Orleans, and how things were going very well in the west for the Union Army. Not well for the Confederacy in the west. But things were going badly for the Union in the east. Remember, they had failed over and over to capture Richmond, Virginia. And they were being in the Battle of Bull Run was very close to Washington, D.C. And that area between Richmond and Washington, D.C. would become a battleground in the east. If you go there today, you can see all the different battles fought in this area. Well, General McClellan was now in charge. Remember, McDowell was taken out of charge because of Bull Run, and we thought McClellan, he's like little Napoleon, that's what they called him, in fact, right here. And he would definitely be able to handle Robert E. Lee, and it hopefully would be a quick campaign to overcome the Confederate army. But we'll find it didn't happen that way. So let's go here a little bit. George McClellan, among the Army's best educated. He was a Christian. I think he was a Catholic Christian. Anyway, he was an excellent organizer and administration. He wanted all the troops to hear the gospel and to go to church too. That's one thing I know about him. But would he be the right man to rebuild the Federal Army after the defeat at Bull Run? But he was extremely cautious, and he always wanted to wait for more troops to come. And that was a problem with McClellan. He was always prone to believe that the other army was stronger than he was. And so he wasn't as courageous as we thought, And also Lincoln would develop a lot of distrust in McClellan. It's kind of weird, but General McClellan would actually run against Abraham Lincoln for president, in Lincoln's second campaign. But we'll get into that in the next chapter. So they came to be not really fond of each other. So McClellan's Peninsular Campaign was in February of 1862. Lincoln ordered General McClellan to march and overtake Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. So he cautiously transported his troops by water to Fort Monroe and stopped there and just rested. He was slow to march, and he arrived in May, but he waited and waited for reinforcements to come. And his timid actions faced an experienced foe. General Robert E. Lee would gain a lead on him. So in the meantime, while he was resting, waiting for reinforcements, Robert E. Lee was making his campaign. And General Robert E. Lee in the South was a military genius. And he was putting together on how to fight this battle and to withhold what was happening here with the Union Army. So there was a battle called 7 Days Battle, June 25th to July 1st of 1862. And it was quite a few battles, as we see here, all these different names, the battle, but they basically called the 7 Days Battle. While General McClellan hesitated, Confederate General Lee received reinforcements from Stonewall Jackson. So now you have a strong Confederate, especially Stonewall Jackson, Lee's right-hand man at this time, came in, and they had reinforced more significantly, probably, than even the Union. Well, the battle lasted 7 days, and Lee pushed McClellan back. So the Confederates are pushing the Union back. And McClellan's Peninsula Campaign was a total failure. The battle was such a loss of life, and it was very, very bloody. In the midst of all this, a lot of Union soldiers died at this time too, as well as Confederates, and McClellan was ordered back to the Potomac. President Lincoln now was in total disappointment of his great General McClellan. And you can see a picture here of Lincoln talking to him. He's very disappointed in what he's doing. He's supposed to be this Napoleon type general, and he turns out to not be that at all. And here you have, the Confederate generals along with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. They're all looking on in the midst of this 7 days battles. Now we're going to have the second battle of Bull Run. Remember where we are, the Confederates, the Union, Confederates won and the Union lost in the first battle. So the Union lost in that disgraceful battle of Bull Run. Now there'll be a second attack. Remember, basically this area was attacked twice because it's only 20 miles from Washington, D.C. And so in August of 1862. So what happens? So General McClellan was replaced by another general. Lincoln came and says, I'm getting him out. He didn't do anything, he's slow to act. And he brings in General John Pope. Pope was opposite. He acted opposite of McClellan. He was very overconfident, thinking he could, I got it handled now, huh? And he started an overland march straight into Richmond, Virginia. And basically, as he went into Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate Army would match him and come out to Bull Run again at Manassas Junction. Remember, Manassas Junction is Bull Run, the Bull Run River. And so basically, here comes the Confederates out there, another battle at Bull Run, the second battle of Bull Run. Again, the Confederates were only 20 miles from Washington, D.C., and General Lee and General Stonewall Jackson, those Confederate generals, they struck General Pope, the Union general, with a stunning blow. He was overconfident. He didn't suspect that they would be so strong. And Lincoln, again, was upset now with Pope. So he decides to bring McClellan, his other general that he let go, back in charge of the Union troops to protect the capital, thinking they're going to come right into Washington, D.C. So he brings McClellan back in. Antietam, Maryland. Antietam was the bloodiest single day. It's a test question. Was the bloodiest single day where the most soldiers were lost in one day? And that would be in Maryland at Antietam. So in the fall of 1862, General Lee, here's General Lee, the Confederate general, made a daring invasion into the North. One thing Lee knew, he knew the South needed to have a speedy victory to win because the South the resources were being drained and Europe didn't seem to be helping the South very much like he thought they would, especially Great Britain. So he anticipated that Great Britain would recognize the Confederacy, and they had not. And so Lee began invading Maryland in September, marching around Washington, towards Washington, but this time not through Virginia and Bull Run, but onto Maryland. And so McClellan followed him again. McClellan was following Lee around as he watched where Lee was going, and they fought at Antietam Creek on September 17th. Would be a big battle, that bloody battle, single day battle, bloodiest battle of one day. The Battle of Antietam, 3,500 soldiers lay dead, 17,000 wounded. And Lee, General Lee of the South, withdrew back across the Potomac into the Virginia area. But McClellan, he refused to pursue Lee. So Lincoln again took McClellan out of command. What in the world? Why didn't you go after Lee? He just stood back and let Lee retreat. Lee is that military genius, and you had him, but then you just let him go. So President Lincoln was very angry with his general, and General McClellan. He was very mad at General Pope. He was very mad at General McDowell, all three of them so far, thinking, what do I have to do? I need to find a general that will fight and pursue the South, and especially needing to get a hold of Robert E. Lee, this military genius. The Battle of Fredericksburg, that happened 1 year after Antietam. And the events, again, did not go well for the Union. So McClellan was taken out of charge, and General A.L. Burnside. I always remember Burnside because he had these sideburns, like Burnside sideburns. And that's what he was known for too, General Burnside. And so he took forth a bold attack on Virginia again, but this time at Fredericksburg, Virginia. And he was repulsed by General Lee and Stonewall Jackson again. The South had it together. The Union suffered a lot of casualties. In fact, 10,000 casualties, twice the amount of the Confederates. So the Union suffered the most, the Battle of Fredericksburg being a defeat. And so it was a defeat, and now Lincoln was now mad at another general through the other three, and he had replaced General Burnside, and he was discouraged, and he replaced General McClellan, and now he replaced him by Burnside, and he was discouraged in Burnside's efforts. And so President Lincoln decided the North needed something to keep Europe out of joining the Confederates. President Lincoln knew if Great Britain and France came in and decided they wanted their cotton from the South and started supporting the South and fighting for the South, that the Union would be split, and the war would be lost, in fact. So he knew he needed to do something else. His generals were not doing a good job on the East. Of course, Grant was doing really well in the West, but Lincoln was concerned with Washington, D.C. and concerned with the East now. So what do you think President Lincoln should do? Let's find out what he did. The Emancipation Proclamation. So he thought it was time to take action against slavery. Basically, this war had to do with slavery, but he never proclaimed it as that way. Lincoln always said that we are fighting against these states seceding from the Union, right? But now he would take the action. So the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. But he drafted it in the summer of 1862, getting it all ready. So the end of September, he announced it would be made as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states would be free. The thing is, all slaves in the rebellious states. Well, in the North, the states were already free, supposedly by the Missouri Compromise above the Mason-Dixon line, up there. So we know that in the North, the slaves were already free. And the slaves had already been set free in all the territories. As for California and the West, the slaves were free. But they weren't in the South, and they weren't in the border states. So he said in the rebellious states, so a lot of people criticized that he didn't set them free in all of the states being the border states. But he was kind of worried about those border states, so he kind of didn't focus on them at the time. But he said that the slaves would be thenceforth and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation would set their slaves in the South free. And he knew that Great Britain did not approve of slavery, so there's no way that Great Britain would come and fight a war for slavery. He knew that. So this would keep Great Britain out of the war, along with France. Would they come and fight a war that would have had to do with slavery, to support slavery? No. They had already fought their own, politics about slavery in Europe. They would not come and fight our politics that had to do with slavery. So Lincoln put forth the slaves would be free to enlist in the Union Army. So now all of the slaves, any slave in the South, any black slave, any African American would now be able to enlist in the Union Army and come to the North and be free. And this would change the course of the war to a moral issue. Instead of seceding from the Union now, the issue now of the whole Civil War would be now focused on slavery, which had been the main issue, but underlining secession, right? So now we have the Battle of Chancellorsville. So this General Burnside, again, one of Lincoln's generals, was again replaced by General Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker. There's a picture of him there. So General Hooker now would be in charge. General Hooker was another overconfident general, and he rallied his troops together thinking, this is going to be quick. Little did he know. But in May 1863, he wanted to do a direct attack on Richmond, just totally attack Richmond. Thinking his troops, he thought, okay, the Union troops outnumber the Confederate troops 2-1. So this should be easy for the North, right? However, General Robert E. Lee, would outmaneuver Hooker's troops, trapping them in Chancellorsville. So they would be trapped there. So how did this happen? Well, Lee, again, it was pretty much of a military genius to work this out, but Hooker's troops were forced to retreat in disgrace. Again, Lincoln would be upset. They retreated over the Rappahannock River. So they went over the Rappahannock River, and now again, but this Battle of Chancellorsville was one of the South's costliest victory. Although it was a victory for the South would lose a lot of men, a lot of soldiers. 13,000 Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded, and 17,000 Union soldiers. So 13,000 and 17,000, that's a lot of soldiers killed at this Battle of Chancellorsville. And this would be the South's greatest or costliest victory, especially for one big reason, is that they would lose their beloved General Stonewall Jackson. General Stonewall Jackson was killed at Chancellorsville. And the sad thing about Jackson, you know how he got killed? Or you know how he was shot? He was shot by accident by one of his own troop members. And he was coming in towards the evening, and he was accidentally shot in the arm, and then he had gangrene in his arm, and had to have his right arm amputated. In the midst of all that, he got pneumonia and died. So like Robert E. Lee said, he lost his I think it was his, I don't know if it was left arm, but anyway, Robert Lee would say he lost his right arm, but he has been my right-handed man. That he loved General Stonewall Jackson, as fighting, as being that second in command. So, in fact, General Stonewall Jackson was a die-hard Christian. In fact, here's what he says. He says, "It is painful enough to discover with what unconcern they speak of war and threaten it. They do not know its war's horrors. I have seen enough of it to make me look upon it as the sum of all evils." General Stonewall Jackson, he hated war. Another thing about Jackson and Lee, they both hated slavery too. Although they fought for the South to defend Virginia, they were both Virginians, and they were defending their home. They were not for slavery at all, and they were not really for succeeding for the Union at all. But they were defending their homeland. It's why they both of them, and they were both Christians. So it's kind of sad, isn't it? At that point, as they couldn't we have not fought this war this way? Even their generals didn't believe in slavery. Crazy. Here's a picture. I think this is a picture of Stonewall Jackson coming in. But just remember, he died at Chancellorsville, and basically generally lost his great general, his great second in command. The Battle of Gettysburg now was in the summer of 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg will be known as the turning point of the Civil War towards the North, but also it would be the Battle of Gettysburg would take a lot of men would die. It became a very bloody battle when I think of Gettysburg. It was the summer of 1863. The Union morale was at its lowest point and General Lee decided to take a bold action. In June of 1863, Lee with 70,000 men crossed the Potomac across Maryland into Pennsylvania. Just remember, Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania now, and they hadn't fought the battles in Pennsylvania yet. So Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. So General Lee comes in, across Maryland to Pennsylvania. General Hooker, now remember he's in charge, well, Lincoln's general now, he started north to head them off in Gettysburg. And in the midst of all this, late in June, General Hooker got upset and resigned command, decided not to be in command. And so Lincoln had to come and replace another general. And he came in and replaced by General George G. Meade. Meade, he's a new one. Not McClellan, he's now bringing Meade in. And so on July 1st, 1863, Lee's forces clashed with Meade's, Lee and Meade at Gettysburg. So we have General Meade and we have General Lee, and this becoming a great battle, as you see. Here's some pictures of it. Gettysburg was the most decisive and bloodiest battle. The battle raged on for 3 days. So Meade had a great number of men, so the Union had more men, but Lee was determined to hold ground. General Lee was going to not back down. And so there were two different ridges. Just remember the two different ridges. The Union forces took Cemetery Ridge, and that's in South Gettysburg, by a cemetery, Cemetery Ridge. That's where the Union forces were. The Confederate forces were on Seminary Ridge. They kind of sound alike. I get them mixed up. But that was west of Gettysburg. So there's two ridges. The Confederate forces, the South, was on Seminary. Seminary, like a, seminary would be like a, where they train pastors and stuff or whatever. But they called it Seminary Ridge. And that was the Confederates. Cemetery was by a cemetery. Two different ridges, the North and the South. On July 3rd, Lee sent 15,000 men to Cemetery Ridge, from Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge, under General George E. Pickett. They call it Pickett's Charge. So Lee sent his General Pickett, and Pickett's charge charged up Cemetery Ridge, up the ridge towards the Union forces. And the Union started, it's kind of weird that Pickett's charged up this hill, and his men were charging up this hill to get to the top of this hill and to claim Gettysburg for the South, the Union shot down soldiers that were ascending the ridge over and over, just killing them over, like one mother, shooting them all down. But the Confederate troops kept coming up the ridge, even though many of them were getting shot. Finally, only 100 soldiers reached the quest. And they had fierce hand-to-hand combat. They're not just shooting each other, they're fighting each other with fist fights in the midst. This whole, the North and the South fighting hand-to-hand combat with the swords and everything at the top of Cemetery Ridge. Definitely would be a cemetery, right? With Pickett's charge. Pickett was just remember he was the Southern general charging up the hill. And briefly, they brought the Confederate flag and even flew the Confederate flag over Cemetery Ridge, thinking they had won the battles of Gettysburg, but they had not. Gettysburg, even though it was the turning point of the war, at this point, it was a great loss for the North. The Confederates were captured or killed at the ridge. They took down the flag that Confederates had put up there. And now, the next day on July 4th, Independence Day, Lee held his position and he did not attack anymore. So basically, the South had really lost. But Lee started to retreat again. And his retreat was slow because it started raining and it flooded the whole Potomac River. And so Lee was just slowly retreating with all of his forces. General Meade of the North, he didn't even pursue Lee at all because he's like, oh, it's raining. I don't want to go. Let's not go. So he did not pursue General Lee, which was a major mistake, right? So General Robert E. Lee escaped back into Richmond again. What do you think President Lincoln thought? He was totally angry. He said to General Meade, he said, "He was within your easy grasp, but now the war will be prolonged. Your golden opportunity is gone. What are you thinking? Why didn't you pursue?" Lee was retreating so slowly. You could have just gone in there and taken over and taken him captive, but you didn't. So 7,000 soldiers died at Gettysburg. 44,000 were wounded. And Gettysburg was the turning point of the war, but the bloody conflict would not be finished. Again, Robert E. Lee had retreated and they had not overcome Richmond, Virginia. So here we have the pictures there. The Gettysburg Address is the famous address of President Abraham Lincoln. And it happens, he comes into Gettysburg and he is sickened by what he sees there. In fact, during the Gettysburg Address, as he's going there, he writes what he's going to say just on a small, like a napkin or something. And at that time, he's praying. And he will say later on in his memoirs, President Abraham Lincoln would say that he gave his heart to the Lord Jesus Christ. He was actually born again coming to Gettysburg. Seeing Gettysburg, he knew, what can I do? And before this time, Lincoln, he knew of religion and he knew of God, but he had never had, that experience of surrendering his life to the Lord Jesus Christ, and he did that. I have to put that in there, because Gettysburg, the fall of 1863, at the Memorial Cemetery near the battlefield, become the most famous battle was Gettysburg. Most famous in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. If you say one battle, the most famous would be Gettysburg. At the end of the battle, the Union Army of the Potomac had successfully repelled the second invasion of the North of the Confederates Army. But speaking of a new birth and freedom, Abraham Lincoln delivered one of the most memorable speeches in United States history. Several months later, President Lincoln went to Gettysburg to speak at the dedication of the cemetery for the Union war dead. Many had died at Gettysburg. Well, when he went there, Edward Everett was his name. He was the politician there that was going to give a speech there. He spent 2 hours giving blow-by-blow account of how the battle went, and condemned the Confederates as traitors. So this guy, he speaks for 2 hours. And then President Lincoln comes and he gives his 3-minute speech. That's what he had, 3-minute speech. And it's famously called the Gettysburg Address. And he focused on the heroes and basically on how heroism and tragedy of both the North and the South. So he looked at both the North and the South. He didn't criticize the South. And he was looking for the greater union to come, the Gettysburg Address. And here you have Lincoln's memorial. You'll have his Gettysburg Address. Let's go over it and then we'll stop. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we can not dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or distract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. What a great, on November 19th, 1863. Just remember, and that's when Abraham Lincoln gave his heart, his rebirth, to the Lord Jesus Christ.